On August 6, 1945, the world witnessed a preview of the apocalypse. Little did they know, the world had already changed a month earlier, and in fact the stepping stones that led to the nightmarish look to the future had been laid for centuries. From the ancient Greek hypothesis on atoms, to the 18th and 19th century refinement of atomic steady, theory on nuclear physics quickly began to spin in the early 20th century. Heroes of science would spend the intervening years after World War I gaining a greater understanding of the atom and the various elements that make up our world. You may have heard of them: Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, Harold Urey, Ernest Orlando Lawrence, Arthur Compton, J. Robert Oppenheimer. These were men who studied the atom and whose research would play a key role in turning the atom into a superweapon. This is their story. J. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't your stereotypical picture of a scientist. Throughout the 1920s, Oppenheimer would teach and study atomic energy, and would become politically active in the 1930s with the populist rise of Adolf Hitler. He would support the Spanish Republic during its civil war, but would not sway as far left as communism, as he would see similar terrors inflicted by Joseph Stalin. It was around this time that the famed scientist Enrico Fermi was continuing his seminal work in nuclear physics. After moving to the United States in 1939 to avoid the growing war in Europe, Fermi would quickly become aware of news that uranium could fission, or be split into smaller pieces. This news took Fermi into deeper study on nuclear physics, as it gave him an element that could be used to trade its mass for energy, something that could change the world as he knew it. Fermi knew something important, though, that most people didn't. Nuclear fission wasn't just an abstract concept. When controlled, it could become an energy source for the future, but when uncontrolled, it could become a disaster, or worse, a superweapon. This research that brought Fermi and his Hungarian-born scientist co-studier Leo Szilard motivated Fermi to alert the US Department of the Navy on what was possible. With the war in Europe expanding, someone needed to know that this potential weapon could be developed by the wrong people. While he was heard, no progress was made on furthering government assistance. In fact, it wasn't until later, written by Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, was delivered to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on what this science could accomplish, and who else was studying this science. This letter concluded that the Germans could be developing this capability for themselves, and also claimed that, if weaponized, it could destroy a port and its surrounding areas. Einstein also claimed the US would need to increase its ability to procure uranium from abroad, and that the government would need to take careful and deliberate steps to not fall behind in what was becoming a 1940s nuclear arms race. FDR would respond to this letter with the formation of a council to oversee this issue, as well as the commitment of $6,000 in government aid. Today, that'd be a little over $128,000. This low level of commitment would rapidly change after the day that has lived in infamy.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor jolted the United States awake. It could no longer ignore the war in Europe or the war in Asia. These massive empires that had eaten up continents were looking at Uncle Sam, and it was time for Uncle Sam to respond. By this point, British research into nuclear physics was effectively on pause, as the whole country stood against relentless German bombing campaigns and the threat of an amphibious invasion. As a result, the British scientists who had worked on nuclear physics came to the United States to offer their help. This was also the time that FDR decided to get serious on the nuclear letter from Einstein. While Einstein himself couldn't help, as he couldn't gain a security clearance, other scientists like Fermi, Oppenheimer, Urey, and Compton could help. FDR appointed then Colonel George C. Marshall with the task of developing the mysterious and terrifying nuclear weapon that Einstein and Fermi had warned about. Marshall established an office in Manhattan, calling it the Manhattan Engineer District, which would colloquially become known as the Manhattan Project. Progress would be slow at first, and issues would begin to mass as the war became more and more real for the United States. FDR would ultimately relieve Marshall and would replace him with someone who would ultimately deliver him the nuclear bomb. Then Colonel Leslie R. Groves was an engineer. After graduating from West Point, having spent 2 years at MIT, Groves had a successful career in the Army Corps of Engineers, with his last assignment overseeing the wartime buildup of military infrastructure across the United States, and this includes the construction of the Pentagon. Colonel Groves would swiftly become Brigadier General Groves, and the Manhattan Project project would swiftly kick into gear. Groves, partnering with an army of scientists, had to work in secret, and they had to move quickly. Not only could their work control the end of the war, they needed to beat the Germans to the bomb. There was just one massive problem, and it could become the single bottleneck for the entire Manhattan Project. Uranium, the desired fuel for fission, which Einstein had implored FDR to begin gathering in large quantity, is not an element that is ready to use as soon as you mine it. In fact, 99% of natural uranium is known as uranium-238, which could not be used in nuclear fission. It would have to undergo an enrichment process to produce uranium-235, a lighter, more reactive version of uranium. When Groves took over the Manhattan Project, the methods of uranium enrichment were almost entirely theoretical. Groves would have to figure out how to enrich uranium and then enrich a sufficient quantity of uranium to be used in a bomb as quickly as possible. So Groves, an expert administrator, got to work. He commissioned his army of scientists to get to work, scouting locations for new facilities to be built and moving his headquarters from Manhattan to Washington. Several theories were put forth on how to enrich uranium, but two methods were chosen. One was through an electromagnetic process developed by Ernest Orlando Lawrence, and the other was a diffusion process developed by Harold Urey. Groves also had success with producing a fissile plutonium-239, thanks to the work of Arthur Hawley Compton in Chicago. These methods would be scaled up in a new facility at the Clinton Engineer Works near Knoxville, Tennessee. Today, this is the town of Oak Ridge. Groves knew it wasn't enough to just enrich uranium. He had to actually figure out a way to weaponize it. Einstein's letter theorized that such a weapon would be too big to move by aircraft, which is why he described it being used on a ship to detonate in a port. Groves tasked J. Robert Oppenheimer for the duty of weaponizing nuclear energy. The two would work together, gathering a large staff together in the growing facility near Los Alamos, New Mexico. Oppenheimer had a difficult task ahead of him, while the rest of the Manhattan Project moved quickly to explore the unexplored edges of nuclear physics and to tame it in a way that the energy release could be used. Oppenheimer had to expand on this further and find a way to functionally weaponize it. There were no blueprints or conceptual idea on what this weapon would look like, whether it was to be used in a boat as Einstein hypothesized, or shot from an artillery gun, or somehow hoisted up and dropped from a plane. To accomplish this, Oppenheimer tasked scientists for a large chunk of 1943 and 1944 towards the theoretical development of a bomb. Oppenheimer balanced two elements from which to build a bomb, uranium and plutonium. With time being the largest constraint, choices had to be made not only in theorizing these weapons, but in the development itself. While secrecy had been a primary concern for General Groves and the rest of the Manhattan Project, it had grown to a point where secrecy was becoming a challenge. What had originally been a $6,000 government commitment to nuclear research in 1939 had grown into over a $2 billion commitment, with over 100,000 people, including some of the world's top scientists and engineers. That's $2 billion in the 1940s, which today would equate over $33 billion. This absolutely gargantuan project managed to catch the attention of the Soviet Union sometime around 1942, and nested within Los Alamos was a man by the name of Klaus Fuchs, but we'll talk more about him in a later video. While General Groves kept people focused on what only helped with the immediate mission, Oppenheimer was aware that the nuclear weapons he was developing were only the beginning. Theory on a larger, more powerful device, nicknamed Super, laid the foundation for the hydrogen bomb. And while Oppenheimer knew this weapon wouldn't be available by the end of the war, he didn't know that it would have to be developed further as soon as the war was over. As spring 1945 passed, the end was finally in sight. Germany had surrendered, but Japan held firm. Concerns grew about how the war would end in Japan. Discussions had taken place for Japan to surrender, but the United States wanted an unconditional surrender, whereas Japan wanted to surrender with some guarantees. More fighting and destruction would be required to coerce Japan into a surrender. Army Air Corps General Curtis LeMay was on a campaign to destroy every Japanese city until Japan surrendered with firebombing campaigns. However, time continued to be of essence. The US wanted to secure surrender on their terms, without the input of the Soviet Union, which hadn't yet declared war on Japan. With the war in Europe officially over, the clock was ticking to get this accomplished before the Soviets entered into the Pacific War, and thus could gain some leverage in peace arrangements. While the US wouldn't end the war before the Soviets declared war on Japan, there was another major hurdle in the way of peace. A protracted strategic bombing campaign with a blockade was no longer feasible, and an amphibious invasion of the main Japanese island would prove too costly. The bomb was needed, and Oppenheimer's group was nearing the finish line. On July 16th, the first nuclear test unequivocally brought humanity into the nuclear age. While it had been in this age for some time now, the successful tests showed that there was no more room for reversal. The blast vaporized the metal stand which held the bomb, and the fireball was both hotter and brighter than many stars. The Rubicon had been crossed, and standing there, marveling at their work, was General Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, with thoughts to Prometheus, gave his famous quote, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." After witnessing this, Oppenheimer, as well as many of the other Manhattan Project scientists, lobbied that atomic weapons should be under international control, and sought to prevent an arms race that was inevitable. Their work created a monster, and while they tried to put it back in the box, it was free now, and it would hold humanity hostage for decades to come. Further testing was no longer needed. Oppenheimer's work was now done. On August 6th, the US dropped another bomb on the Japanese city on Hiroshima. The number of killed would rise to 200,000 5 years later, as fallout radiation would kill some 130,000 people years after the bomb fell. Still, Japan did not surrender, and on August 9th, the US dropped another bomb on Nagasaki, killing 140,000 people with a similar lag in death due to radiation sickness among survivors. Finally, the Japanese surrendered, and the war was over. The Manhattan Project, successful as it was, would transition into the peacetime owner of America's nuclear stockpile, and would eventually undergo organizational changes that would become America's present-day nuclear force. The men that gave America the bomb would spend the rest of their lives marked by this project. General Groves would go on to retire and write a book on his experiences, and would later pass away in 1970. J. Robert Oppenheimer would help the US government manage nuclear energy and weapons, but scandals that claimed his loyalty was not with the US would end his career with the government. This scandal, however, would later prove to be manufactured. Oppenheimer's loyalty was unquestionable. He would later oppose the development of the hydrogen bomb, which his project had first identified as a possibility, and would pass away in 1967. Enrico Fermi, who worked on America's quest for the bomb since before America even realized it needed a bomb, would work alongside the US government after the war. When the Soviet Union announced that it had developed nuclear weapons, Fermi and his colleagues would vehemently oppose the development of thermonuclear weapons, calling them tools of genocide. Nevertheless, he would be sent back to Los Alamos to develop the hydrogen bomb, which he hoped wasn't technically possible. His hopes would be let down, however, and the US and Soviet Union would race with each other to produce larger and larger nuclear weapons. Fermi would continue his studies, including the theorizing of what we call the Fermi paradox, which seeks to answer why we haven't been contacted by other civilizations from across the universe. He would pass away in 1954. The Manhattan Project brought humanity into the nuclear age, an age that has given us cleaner forms of energy and clearer paths towards extinction. It's transformed mankind's relationship with violence and has marked the way people react to war. While it brought good, it also brought tremendous evil, and it demonstrated reasons on why many more countries would want to have nuclear weapons themselves. It also gave men of science a space to rapidly advance humanity's understanding of physics and the universe, but did so as the birthing ground for a monster that would haunt those men who would feel as though they had become death, destroyers of worlds.